Have you ever wondered what would happen if the person who once humiliated you completely lost everything and came back begging for a second chance? Would you walk away or dare to believe they could change? This is a story about two broken souls who found something worth saving in the wreckage of their past. And trust me, by the end, you'll question everything you thought you knew about forgiveness and redemption. If this story moved you even a little, don't just scroll away. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss another story that will challenge your heart. Share this video with someone who believes people can change and leave a comment below telling us, would you give a second chance to someone who hurt you? Let's see how many of you believe in starting over. It was the last Friday of winter in Seattle, the kind of night when freezing rain pounded the sidewalk so hard it bounced back like glass splinters. Grace Miller pulled her thin jacket tighter around her shoulders as she stepped out of the old brick community center where she worked the late shift. The chill sliced right through her, but she'd gotten used to that. What she hadn't gotten used to was the silence that settled in after a long night, like the world held its breath while she crossed the empty street. She was halfway to her beat-up Corolla when something made her stop. At the corner of 4th and Pine Right, beneath a flickering street lamp, a man was kneeling on the soaked pavement. He looked out of place, his tailored wool coat dark with rain, the cuffs dragging in a dirty puddle. His shoulders hunched, like he'd been there a long time. Grace felt a strange prickle down her spine. She thought about walking faster, but her eyes dropped to the crumpled paper he clutched in both hands, some kind of legal document stamped and wrinkled. He was shaking either from the cold or from whatever was written on that page. Her heart told her to keep moving. This wasn't her problem. She had seen enough wreckage to know when to step around it. But something kept her rooted in place. Maybe it was the way the man's head hung so low she couldn't see his face. Maybe it was the tiny, hopeless motion of his thumb brushing the edge of the paper over and over. She took a breath, stepped closer. "Sir?" She called, her voice louder than she meant it to be, fighting the noise of the rain hammering the asphalt. He didn't look up. She tried again, softer this time. "Are you all right?" For a moment, nothing happened. Then slowly, he lifted his head, and the second she saw his face, her stomach twisted. Nathan Everett. The same Nathan Everett, who used to stride through the mirrored hallways of Everett Group like he owned the air everyone breathed. The CEO who'd once looked her up and down and told her she was forgettable. The man whose signature had been at the bottom of her termination papers. Their eyes locked and something flickered behind his shock, maybe, or shame. Rain streaked across his cheekbones, dripping off the hard line of his jaw, but he didn't wipe it away. He didn't say a word. Grace's pulse thudded in her ears. All she could think was, he deserves this. Whatever mess he was in, he'd probably made it himself. She remembered the way he'd spoken to her, that cool contempt. How he'd smirked when she'd tried to defend herself the day she spilled his coffee by accident. He hadn't even looked her in the eye then. She'd been nothing, less than nothing. Her first instinct was to walk away, to let the universe teach him whatever lesson he was learning. And she nearly did. She shifted her weight, turned her shoulder to leave. But just as she started to step back, Nathan made a noise, something between a gasp and a broken laugh. He stared down at the paper, his voice rough as gravel when it finally came out. "I lost everything," he muttered, as if to the ground. All of it. The words hit her in a place she didn't expect. Grace closed her eyes, fighting the hot flush of pity she didn't want to feel. Because even though she knew she should hate him, maybe she still did, she couldn't pretend she didn't understand what it was like to have nothing. She looked at him again. His expensive coat was soaked through his hair, plastered against his forehead. But it wasn't the ruined suit or the damp paper that got to her. It was the way he looked, so completely, utterly lost. Grace exhaled, steadying her voice. "You can't stay here," she said, sharper than she meant. "You'll freeze." His eyes lifted to hers again, wide and almost dazed. "Why would you care?" That was it. The question that cracked something in her. She almost told him she didn't care, almost walked away for good. But she didn't. Because somehow, even after everything, she couldn't leave someone in the rain to drown in their own despair. Not even him. She held out her hand, palm open. "Come on," she said quietly. "Let's get you inside." And for the first time, she could remember Nathan Everett did exactly what she asked. He took her hand without argument. Grace didn't let herself think as she pulled Nathan to his feet. His hand was cold as ice in hers, heavier than she expected, and for a second she felt the strangest flicker of triumph. The mighty Nathan Everett, the man who'd once looked down on her like she was chewing gum, stuck to his Italian shoe, was too broken to stand on his own. But the flicker died as quickly as it came. This wasn't about revenge, and she wouldn't let herself pretend it was. She looped her arm around his and started guiding him across the sidewalk. He stumbled once, nearly knocking them both into a newspaper box, but she tightened her grip, steadying him without a word. The little cafe on the corner was still open, its neon sign buzzing in the dark. Grace pushed the door with her shoulder, feeling the blast of warm air hit her face as they stepped inside. It smelled like burnt espresso and wet wool. A couple of college kids at a table looked up, eyes widening when they saw Nathan's soaked suit and blank stare. Grace ignored them. She steered Nathan to a corner booth and made him sit. He didn't protest, but he didn't thank her either. His hands dropped to the table, still clenched around that ruined document. For a few seconds, she stood over him, catching her breath. Rain dripped off the ends of her hair onto the floor. Nathan didn't look up. He just stared at the paper like it was a bomb that had already gone off. She turned away and marched to the counter, her voice low but steady as she ordered 2 coffees. When she came back, she set one in front of him, without asking if he wanted it. "Drink," she said flatly. Nathan flinched, just a flicker of movement, but he didn't touch the cup. His jaw tightened as he finally lifted his head, his gaze locking with hers. The fluorescent light overhead showed every line of exhaustion in his face, every edge that used to look so sharp. "You think this makes you better than me?" His voice was hoarse, brittle, the same tone he'd once used to dismiss an entire department. "You think I need your pity?" The question hung there, bitter and raw. Grace felt the heat rise in her chest, anger mingling with something she refused to name. Her hands planted on the table between them, she leaned in, her voice low and cutting. "Do you remember the day you fired me? You didn't even say my name. You just told HR I was... What was it?" She didn't wait for him to answer. She could see in his eyes he knew exactly what she meant. "Forgettable," she spat. "You said I was forgettable. Like I wasn't even a person. Like my whole life was worth less than the carpet you had imported from Italy." Nathan's stare dropped. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Grace forced herself to breathe. She hadn't planned to say any of this, but seeing him there, stripped of every illusion of power, had cracked something she thought was sealed shut. And yet, she said, her tone softening only a fraction, "Here I am. Because no matter what you did, I won't leave anyone in the street to freeze. Even you." For the first time, she thought she saw something behind his eyes that wasn't contempt or arrogance. It looked an awful lot like shame. He swallowed hard, staring at the table. "I didn't..." She cut him off before he could finish. "Save it. You don't owe me an apology. Not tonight." He went quiet again. The rain hammered against the window so hard it sounded like hail. In the far corner, someone laughed over a phone call, but in that booth, everything was silent, stretched tight between them. Grace sat down across from him, her arms folding over her chest. She watched him fight to keep what was left of his pride, even as his shoulders slumped lower and lower. Maybe part of her wanted to see him broken. Maybe she'd earned that much. But the rest of her felt hollow looking at the wreck he'd become. Slowly, she pushed his coffee closer, her voice quiet but firm. "Drink it. You look like hell." He stared at the cup as if it might bite him. Then, with a shudder, he picked it up. His hand shook so badly some of the coffee splashed onto the table. Grace didn't flinch. She didn't reach to clean it. Instead, she sat back and met his gaze head on, her voice steady as she spoke words she hadn't planned to say. "You're not the only one who lost something, Nathan, but tonight isn't about the past. It's about whether you're going to sit here feeling sorry for yourself or stand up and figure out what comes next." For the first time since she'd pulled him off the pavement, he looked like he was really seeing her. Nathan didn't lift his head for a long time. The cafe had gone quiet, except for the rain and the soft clink of mugs behind the counter. Grace sat across from him, watching the man who once controlled a $1 billion company crumble in a booth that smelled like stale cinnamon rolls. Finally, when he did look up, his eyes were bloodshot and hollow. He gripped the edge of the table like it was the last solid thing he had left. She didn't prompt him. If he was going to speak, it had to be his choice. His voice came out low, scraping almost too soft to hear over the downpour outside. It was all gone in less than 6 months. Grace didn't blink. She kept her expression neutral, though her heart thudded once hard. My CFO had been cooking the books. He continued staring somewhere past her shoulder. Inflated earnings, hidden debt. When it finally came out, the board blamed me. Investors pulled everything. By the time the SEC showed up, there wasn't anything left to save. His jaw tightened. I tried to keep control. I thought if I worked harder, if I just pushed through, it would settle. But every time I turned around, there was another fire. Another lie I hadn't seen coming. Grace felt a prickle of something she didn't want to name. Sympathy. She folded her arms tighter. And when it all finally collapsed, Nathan went on, his voice going thinner. The woman I was supposed to marry. She said she couldn't handle the scandal. She left the same day the bank froze my accounts. He laughed once, a dry, empty sound. I lost her, the company, everything that mattered. And the worst part is, he paused. His fingers dug into the tabletop until his knuckles whitened. The worst part, he whispered, is that I'm not sure I blame her for leaving. Grace closed her eyes for a second. She remembered the headlines. Everett Group implodes in fraud investigation. She just hadn't cared enough to connect it to the man who'd fired her without a second thought. But seeing him like this, stripped of all the power he'd hidden behind, was nothing like she'd imagined. It wasn't satisfying. It was unsettling. Like watching a skyscraper collapse in slow motion. Nathan's head dropped into his hands. His shoulders shook once, and for a moment, Grace thought he might be crying. But when he looked up again, his eyes were dry, just flat, defeated. I have nothing, he said again, voice rasping. Nothing. She thought of that afternoon years ago, standing in his office, her hands trembling as she tried to explain that the coffee spill hadn't been her fault. He hadn't even looked at her face, just signed the termination slip and waved her away like she was a gnat. Part of her wanted to remind him of that, to make him feel the same humiliation she'd carried out of that building. But she didn't, because somewhere in the last hour, the old hate had drained out of her. What was left wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was something close to understanding. She reached into her purse and pulled out a simple white business card. She turned it over once between her fingers before sliding it across the table toward him. Nathan didn't look at it right away. He kept staring at the wood grain like it might open up and swallow him whole. Finally, she spoke, her voice quieter than she meant. This is the address of the community center I work at. They have counselors, people who can help you figure out what comes next. He lifted his gaze, eyes bleary. Why would you help me? Grace held his stare without flinching. Because I won't be like you were. I won't pretend someone's suffering doesn't matter. The words hung between them sharper than anything she'd said that night. Nathan swallowed his Adam's apple, bobbing hard. His hand reached for the card, but stopped halfway, hovering in the air, like he was afraid to take it. Grace didn't move. She didn't soften. She just watched him. After a long moment, he closed his fingers around the card. His shoulders sagged, as if even that tiny act had cost him what little strength he still possessed. She stood, slipping her bag over her shoulder. Tomorrow, she said evenly, if you want to talk to someone, come by. If you don't, I won't come looking. Nathan didn't answer. He just sat there in that cracked vinyl booth, clutching the card like it was the last piece of proof he hadn't disappeared completely. Grace walked to the door. For the first time since she'd spotted him in the rain, she felt something close to peace. She didn't owe him anything, but maybe she'd just given him the only thing that mattered, a chance to start over. The next morning, Grace was almost convinced he wouldn't show. By noon, she'd sorted 2 crates of donated coats and set up chairs in the counseling room. Each time the front door swung open, her chest tightened, but it was always someone else. An elderly woman with her grandson, a teenager asking about job applications, a man from the shelter picking up lunch vouchers. It was easier to believe Nathan Everett had disappeared back into the city, swallowed up by the same pride that had always kept him untouchable. Part of her hoped he had. It would be simpler that way. But a little before 1, the door opened again, and she felt her pulse jump before she even turned to look. Nathan stood just inside the threshold, his hair still damp from the drizzle outside, his posture stiff. He wasn't wearing the expensive coat anymore, just a wrinkled gray sweater and jeans that didn't fit quite right. For a second, he looked like any other lost soul who came through these doors. But then their eyes met, and she saw all the history behind his. She didn't smile. She didn't nod. She only stepped aside, letting him walk past into the main room. He hesitated at the row of folding chairs, as if unsure whether he belonged. Then he picked one in the corner and sat down heavily, his hands clasped between his knees. Grace forced herself to keep moving, straightening papers on the counter, pretending her heart wasn't slamming against her ribs. 10 minutes passed, then 20. He didn't say a word. He just stared at the linoleum floor, like it might offer him an escape. Finally, Grace couldn't stand the silence any longer. She crossed the room, stopping a few feet away from where he sat. "You didn't have to come," she said evenly. Nathan's jaw twitched, but he didn't look up. "I know." More silence. She thought about walking away, letting him sit there until he decided what he was doing. But the memory of last night, the way his voice had broken when he said, "I have nothing," held her in place. Slowly, he lifted his head. His eyes were rimmed red, but his expression was clearer than she'd ever seen it. No arrogance, no defense, just raw, scraped honesty. "I don't expect you to believe this," he began, voice rough, "but I never thought about you after that day." Grace's fingers curled around the edge of a chair. She didn't interrupt. "You were just one more thing in a long list of problems," he continued. "I signed the paper because it was easier than asking questions, because it didn't matter to me whether you deserved it or not." He exhaled shakily. That's what I was. A man who didn't care about the people around him. Grace's throat felt tight. She thought of all the nights she'd replayed that moment in his office. How small she'd felt standing there. How she'd promised herself she'd never let anyone make her invisible again. Nathan's gaze didn't waver. His voice dropped to almost a whisper. "I was wrong." For a moment, it felt like the room had shrunk down to just the two of them and the space between their regrets. "I'm sorry," he said finally, his hands clenching together until his knuckles showed white. "For that day. For every day after when I didn't even remember your name." Grace drew in a slow breath, feeling her chest expand in a way it hadn't in years. Part of her wanted to say the words he probably needed, "I forgive you." But she couldn't. Not yet. She stepped past him toward the little kitchenette in the corner. She poured hot water over a tea bag, watching the color bloom in the cup. Her hands didn't shake. When she came back, she set the tea on the table in front of him. Not as a gesture of acceptance, just something human. "You look like you haven't slept," she said quietly. "Drink that. It helps." Nathan glanced down at the cup. For a heartbeat, his expression flickered with confusion. Then something softer, something almost like relief settled into his eyes. He lifted the tea with both hands, as if it weighed more than he could carry alone. His shoulders eased just enough to see he'd hurt her. Grace didn't sit with him. She didn't say she forgave him or that he deserved anything at all. But she stayed close enough that if he spoke again, she would hear every word. After that first apology, Nathan didn't vanish again. He started coming to the community center almost every day. At first, Grace thought he might be looking for pity, or some easier way to feel redeemed. But as the weeks passed, she realized he didn't ask anyone for anything, not special treatment, not comfort, not a way out. He showed up early and left late. He took whatever task needed doing, fixing broken shelves in the reading nook, unloading boxes of canned food, sorting the donations pile until his knuckles turned raw. And he never complained. Grace watched him work from a distance. She told herself she was only making sure he didn't slack off or try to take credit for something he hadn't earned. But deep down, she was searching for proof that the man she remembered, cold, superior, dismissive, was gone. Little by little, she found it. The first time she noticed was the afternoon he repaired a set of rickety metal chairs. Years ago, Nathan Everett would have called someone else to handle it. He would have stood back, arms folded, issuing orders in that polished voice that made people feel small. Now, he didn't say a word as he knelt on the concrete floor, sleeves pushed to his elbows, sweat darkening the collar of his plain t-shirt. His hands moved steadily, even when the old screws refused to budge. Grace walked past and pretended not to notice the grease streaking his wrists. But her chest felt tight in a way she didn't understand. A week later, she came in early on a rainy morning and found him alone in the library corner, rearranging the children's books by hand. He didn't see her standing there. He was humming under his breath, just a quiet, uncertain melody she'd never heard from him before. That was the moment she realized he wasn't pretending. He was trying to rebuild something he'd lost long before his fortune disappeared, his own decency. Still, Grace didn't make it easy. She kept her interactions brief, her tone neutral. She wasn't ready to open the door any further. But Nathan never pressed. If he was disappointed, he didn't show it. He just kept showing up. One evening, she stayed late to finish inventory in the back hall. The center had emptied out, the volunteers gone home, the overhead lights dimmed to save electricity. She almost didn't notice him in the half-darkness, tucked behind a row of battered folding chairs. He was sitting on a stool, with a cracked vinyl cushion in his lap, sewing up a split seam with awkward stitches. His breath came out in shaky puffs in the cold air. Grace froze in the doorway, heart lurching at the sight of his hands trembling around the needle and thread. He didn't see her. He just kept working, jaw clenched like he was holding himself together by force. The same man who used to sign checks big enough to buy half the block was struggling to mend an old chair because he'd promised he'd help. She should have turned around, given him privacy, but she couldn't move. A memory flashed her first week as a receptionist when she'd tried to speak up in a meeting. Nathan hadn't even looked at her. He'd leaned back in his chair and said in front of everyone, "If you don't have something useful to add, you can leave." Now he looked so far from that man, she almost didn't recognize him. Without thinking, she stepped into the light. The floor creaked, and his head jerked up. Their eyes met. Neither spoke. For a few heartbeats, the room felt too small for all the things unsaid between them. He swallowed, voice rough when he finally managed to speak. "The seam was tearing, and I thought I could." His hand shook again, and the needle slipped, pricking his thumb. A bead of blood welled up. Grace moved before she could stop herself. She crossed the floor and reached for his hand. Gently, she took the needle away, her thumb brushing his skin. "You'll ruin your fingers if you keep going like that," she murmured. Nathan stared at her, breathing hard. His eyes weren't proud anymore. They were just tired and grateful. Grace felt something shift in her chest, something she'd been holding back for too long. For the first time, she didn't step away. She let the silence stand between them like a fragile truce neither of them wanted to break. 2 weeks later, the community center held its annual fundraiser, a night Grace had dreaded and prepared for in equal measure. The main hall was crowded with donors and volunteers, the tables stacked with silent auction baskets and stacks of homemade cookies. Strings of white lights glowed overhead, softening the edges of the battered walls. Grace moved between the groups, smiling politely, accepting envelopes, thanking strangers for their generosity. But her thoughts kept snagging on the empty space by the door, wondering if he'd come. Then she saw him. Nathan stood near the entrance, hands tucked awkwardly in the pockets of his second-hand jacket. He looked out of place amid the polished business people and cheerful retirees. But he was here. Their eyes met across the crowd. Grace swallowed, forcing herself not to look away. Nathan didn't approach her right away. He drifted to the donations table, waiting in line behind a man writing a check. When it was his turn, he reached inside his coat and pulled out a worn leather wallet. Grace watched as he opened it, methodical and careful, like he was bracing himself. His fingers hesitated over a folded slip of paper tucked behind his driver's license. When he finally set the check on the table, the volunteer handling donations blinked, then looked up at him. "Are you sure you want to give this much?" she asked gently. Nathan's jaw tightened. "It's all I have left," he said. "It needs to count for something." The volunteer nodded, her expression softening. She handed him a receipt. Grace felt her throat close. She turned away before he could catch her staring, pretending to busy herself arranging the plastic cups near the refreshment table. But a few minutes later, she sensed him behind her. She didn't move when he stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the heat of his body in the cold draft from the doors. "I'm not here to make a scene," Nathan said quietly. "I just needed to be part of this." Grace set down the cup she was holding and turned to face him. "You didn't have to give anything," she said, her voice soft but firm. "You've done more than enough." He shook his head once. "I spent years throwing money at problems to make them disappear. This isn't that." She searched his eyes, trying to find the man she'd known, the one who would have scoffed at the idea of giving away his last cent for something he couldn't leverage. But he wasn't there anymore. "What happens when that check bounces?" she asked, her tone sharper than she meant. Nathan didn't flinch. "Then I'll owe you an apology on top of everything else." Grace felt her chest twist, part exasperation, part something more fragile. When the fundraiser finally began to wind down, she slipped out to the entryway to catch her breath. She thought she was alone, until she heard the door creak. Nathan stood in the doorway, hands shoved deep in his pockets, again, like he was afraid of what he'd say if he let them free. She opened her mouth to thank him, but he spoke first. "You don't understand," he said, voice hoarse. "You are the only person who didn't turn away from me." He stepped closer, and she could see how hard he was fighting to keep his expression steady. "Everyone else ran my board, my fiancé, my so-called friends. But you—" His hand lifted, hovering in the air, before it landed against the doorframe, steadying himself. "You stayed." Grace's heart hammered. She tried to think of something to say that would close the distance without making promises she wasn't ready to keep. "I haven't forgotten who you were," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "The things you did. How you made me feel." Nathan swallowed hard, his jaw working. But she went on, her words slow and deliberate. "I see someone else standing here now." The raw honesty in his eyes hit her like a wave. For a moment, neither of them breathed. Nathan's gaze dropped to the scuffed floor, then lifted back to her. "I don't expect you to forgive me, or to believe that I'm different." He reached for her hand, not forcing, just an invitation. His palm was warm and unsteady. "But I had to tell you," he said, his voice breaking. "You're the only person who made me feel like I could be more than what I was." Grace felt something crack open in her chest, something she hadn't let herself name. Slowly, she closed her fingers around his. And in that small, silent moment, neither of them felt alone anymore. A few days after the fundraiser, Grace arrived at the community center just after sunrise. The air smelled like damp concrete and fresh coffee from the cart parked on the corner. She unlocked the side door, her mind already on the long list of supplies that needed restocking before the weekend. But when she stepped inside, she stopped short. Nathan was already there, sitting on the edge of a folding chair near the supply closet. He looked up the moment she entered, his hands clasped tight, like he was holding on to something he couldn't let slip. Grace's heart thudded uneasy. She set her tote bag on the table. "Did you need something?" He stood, took a step toward her, then seemed to think better of it. "I need to ask you something," he said carefully. She folded her arms. "All right." Nathan drew in a slow breath, like he'd practiced every word. "I want to work here. Full-time." The sentence hit her like a jolt of cold water. Grace blinked, certain she'd misheard. "You... what I mean it." He pressed, voice steadier now. "Not as a donor, not as a volunteer who can come and go. I want to stay here. I want this to be my job." She stared at him, searching for any trace of the old arrogance, any hint this was just another attempt to buy redemption. But his face was open, earnest, and strangely vulnerable. Her mind raced. "You know we don't pay much," she said finally, her tone neutral. "You'd be earning minimum wage, cleaning, lifting, stocking, whatever's needed." "I know," Nathan said simply. She swallowed. "And how long do you plan to do that?" He held her gaze, unflinching. "As long as it takes for you to believe I'm not the man I was." For a moment, Grace couldn't find her voice. All she could think about was the Nathan she'd known, the one who'd fired her, with a flick of his hand, who'd never once imagined he might end up here asking for work he would have once called beneath him. Her throat tightened. You can't undo the past, she whispered. I'm not trying to. He said, his voice low but clear. I'm trying to prove that your faith in me wasn't wasted, that someone can lose everything and still become better. The silence between them stretched so long she could hear the hum of the old refrigerator in the kitchen. She wished she could retreat behind the professional distance she'd built, but standing there with him, it felt flimsy, like paper in the rain. Grace looked down at her hands to steady herself. I don't know if this is a good idea, she admitted. People will talk. They'll say you're here for the wrong reasons. Let them talk, Nathan said quietly. I'm not here for them. Her head lifted sharply, and their eyes locked again. This time, she couldn't look away. I'm here, he went on, voice thick with something raw, because you showed me what it looks like when someone doesn't give up on a person who doesn't deserve a second chance. And I can't walk away from that. Grace felt her heart lurch, torn between doubt and something she refused to call hope. You're serious, she murmured. His answer was immediate. I'm more serious about this than I've ever been about anything. The last defenses she'd built around her heart shuddered under the weight of his conviction. She drew a slow breath, her voice quieter than she meant. All right, she said, her tone as steady as she could make it. We'll start you in the supply room, if you're willing to do the work. Nathan exhaled shakily, and for the first time a hint of a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. I am, he said. I will. And for the first time in all the years she'd known him, Grace almost believed him. The weeks that followed tested them both in ways neither could have predicted. Nathan started every morning before dawn, unlocking the back door and hauling crates of donations up the narrow hallway. Grace tried to pretend she didn't notice how easily he slipped into the rhythm of the work. He stocked shelves, sorted canned goods, assembled care packages, and stayed late when the rest of the volunteers went home. By the second month, he'd quietly fixed the broken light over the library shelves and patched the peeling paint along the south wall. No one asked him to, but he did it anyway. Grace caught herself watching him more often, searching for signs he was performing, that any of it was a ploy. But the performance never came. The man who once wielded power like a weapon never tried to remind anyone who he used to be. They planned a food drive in February, the first big project they'd worked on together since he became staff. Grace found herself surprised by how easily they divided the tasks. He handled logistics and spreadsheets, she organized volunteers and supplies. It was efficient, seamless, almost like they'd been doing it for years. Sometimes, in quiet moments, she almost forgot who he had been to her before everything fell apart. Almost. One night, after a long shift sorting winter coats, Grace stayed behind to tally receipts. A cold rain hammered the windows, and the power flickered twice before holding steady. She was so focused on the numbers that she didn't hear him approach. "Everything okay?" Nathan asked quietly. She startled, her pencil falling from her hand. "It's fine," she said too quickly, brushing hair from her damp cheek. "Just budgets." He watched her a moment, eyes searching her face. "Grace." She didn't answer. Her throat had gone tight, and she couldn't risk her voice cracking. He stepped closer, just enough that she could see the way the rain had beaded on his shoulders. "Talk to me," he said gently. "If something's wrong, let me help." Her resolve splintered. She set her hands flat on the table and bowed her head. "We're short on funding again," she admitted, in a rush. "We had 3 grants fall through, and I don't know how I'm supposed to keep the lights on another month. I'm tired, Nathan. I'm so tired of pretending we can do this with nothing." For a moment, the only sound was the rain ticking steadily against the old glass. When she finally looked up, she expected pity, or worse, another offer of money she couldn't accept. But what she saw instead was something simpler: understanding. Nathan reached out his hand, hesitating in the air before it settled lightly on her shoulder. His touch was warm, grounding. "Let me stay," he said, voice steady but low. "Let me be here to do my part." She shook her head, her eyes blurring. "You already have. You've done more than I ever expected. Then let me do more." He pressed his thumb, brushing the edge of her sweater. "You're not alone in this. Not anymore." The words cracked something inside her she hadn't realized was still fragile. She closed her eyes, trying to hold back the tears that had been building all week. But one slipped free, trailing down her cheek. She felt him catch it with the side of his thumb, a touch so careful it made her chest ache. "I can't promise I'll fix everything," he whispered, "but I can promise I won't walk away." Grace opened her eyes. For the first time since the night she'd found him in the rain, she saw him without the shadows of the past crowding between them. And for the first time she believed him. The power flickered again, and the lights above them dimmed to a soft glow. It felt fitting somehow, like the universe had decided they'd both earned a moment of quiet. Grace didn't step back. She didn't pull away. She nodded once, her voice soft but sure. "Then stay," she said. "We'll figure the rest out together." Nathan's hand tightened on her shoulder, and for a few precious seconds, neither of them said another word. The rain kept falling. The world kept turning. And in that small corner of the city, something broken was finally starting to heal. The night the community center was honored for its impact, Grace almost didn't recognize the place. The battered walls were hidden behind banners and strings of white lights. A local news crew was setting up by the front desk. Tables were crowded with neighbors and volunteers, people she'd seen every week, and others she hadn't met before. She moved through it all with a smile that felt both surreal and hard-won. For once, there was no crisis waiting in the wings, no bills she couldn't pay, just a few hours to breathe and remember why she'd started this work in the first place. Nathan stayed near the back, a step behind the crowd. He wore a clean button-down and the same scuffed boots he'd worked in for months. His hands were folded, his expression careful. He hadn't tried to claim credit, even when the director called out the names of key contributors. When the applause rolled through the room, he only nodded, eyes fixed on the floor. Grace felt something in her chest twist. Months ago, she wouldn't have believed this moment could exist, standing here with him, surrounded by proof that people could change, that nothing was beyond repair. The ceremony wrapped with a round of polite laughter and the promise of a newspaper feature. One by one, the guests trickled out into the cold. The lights dimmed, leaving the center hushed and golden in the afterglow. Grace stayed behind, collecting stray programs and half-empty cups. She could feel Nathan watching her from the shadows near the doorway, but he didn't move. When she finally turned, she found him standing exactly where he'd been all night. He looked tired, like he'd been holding himself in check for too long. "You should be proud," she said softly, her voice echoing in the quiet. "This place wouldn't be standing without you." Nathan met her gaze, his jaw tight. "I didn't do it alone." "No," she agreed. "You didn't." They stood in silence, the moment stretching between them. For the first time there was no bitterness, no shame, just the quiet recognition of everything they'd survived. Grace took a slow breath and stepped closer. "You know," she began, her voice trembling, "I spent so long thinking I'd never see you as anything but the man who humiliated me." Nathan swallowed hard, his hands flexing at his sides. "But that's not true anymore," she continued. "You're not the man I used to hate." His eyes closed, like he was bracing for impact. When he spoke, his voice was rough. "I'm not the man you used to pity either." Grace felt her throat close. For a heartbeat, all the memories pressed in the cold rain, the night she'd found him on the sidewalk, the brittle words he'd thrown at her in the cafe, the nights they'd spent working side by side until dawn blurred into morning. She reached out her hand, hovering in the space between them. The last time she'd touched him, it had been to pull him up off the floor, to steady him when he couldn't stand on his own. This time was different. Her fingers closed around his, not in rescue, but in choice. Nathan looked down at their joined hands like he wasn't sure he was allowed to hold on. When he finally lifted his eyes, the raw hope there nearly broke her. In the soft glow of the hallway light, nothing needed to be said. She tightened her grip just enough to let him feel that she meant it, that she wasn't offering pity or forgiveness out of duty. She was offering something she'd thought she'd never trust herself to feel again. Grace drew in a slow, steady breath. "I don't know where this goes," she admitted, her voice low, "but I don't want to keep pretending like I don't see you." Nathan's hand squeezed hers, back his palm warm against her skin. "Then don't," he whispered. She felt her heart steady. For the first time in years, she wasn't carrying it alone. In that small, golden pool of light, they stood together, no longer bound by the past. Not rescuer and lost man, not enemies, Just two people who had clawed their way back to something that felt like hope. And when Grace finally let herself smile, it felt like the start of something she didn't have to be afraid of. 1 year later, the sidewalk outside the community center looked nothing like the place where it all began. The cracked concrete had been replaced with smooth paving stones. A little garden lined the brick wall, bright with spring flowers. And near the entrance, a new wooden bench stood beneath the overhang where the rain used to pour down in sheets. A small carved plaque had been mounted on the backrest. In plain, careful lettering, it read, "The Second Chance Bench, where anyone can begin again." Grace traced the words with her fingertips as she sat down. Her heart felt steady in a way it hadn't in years. The center was thriving, more volunteers, more funding, more families helped than she'd ever dreamed possible. But it wasn't the programs or the recognition that mattered most. It was this being able to look around and know that broken things could be made whole, that people could choose to change. Nathan settled beside her, close enough that their shoulders brushed. He didn't say anything at first. He just studied the little plaque, his expression thoughtful. "I never imagined my life would end up here," he said finally, his voice low. She smiled faintly. "Neither did I." He turned, meeting her eyes. "Do you regret it?" The question took her by surprise. She thought about all the nights she'd wondered if trusting him was a mistake, about the moments when old anger still rose sharp and unbidden. But when she looked at him now, this man who had worked every day to prove he was no longer the same, she felt nothing but quiet certainty. "No," she said simply. "I don't regret any of it." Nathan exhaled, the tension in his shoulders softening. He reached for her hand without hesitation, lacing their fingers together. For a long moment they sat in silence, the afternoon sun warming their joined hands. There was no rush to fill the quiet. No need to pretend that either of them was anything but human, imperfect, and trying. Grace looked at the street where she'd first seen him, kneeling in the rain, clutching a piece of paper, like it was all he had left. The memory didn't sting the way it once had. It felt almost like a beginning instead of an ending. She turned back to him, her voice gentle. "We were both lost that night." Nathan's grip tightened, his gaze steady. "But we found something better." "No more pity," she whispered. "No more pride," he said. Grace leaned her head against his shoulder. In that simple, unguarded moment, the past finally felt finished. No longer the man she used to despise. No longer the woman he once dismissed. Just two people who had learned step by step that sometimes the second chance was the one that mattered most. And as the breeze rustled the plaque behind them, Grace closed her eyes and let herself believe it fully. They were exactly where they were meant to be. Sometimes life brings people back into our path for a reason we can't understand right away. This story reminds us that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting the hurt someone caused you. It means allowing yourself the freedom to move forward without carrying the weight of resentment. Grace and Nathan started as enemies. One humiliated the other, too proud to care. Yet, when everything fell apart, their humanity was all that remained. The lesson is simple, but powerful. No one is beyond redemption if they're willing to do the hard work to change. We all have the capacity to grow past our worst mistakes. And sometimes, the people we least expect can show us how. Whether it's rebuilding trust, owning up to past failures, or simply offering someone a chance to prove they've changed, these moments define our character more than any success ever could. If this story touched your heart, share your thoughts in the comments. Would you forgive someone who once hurt you? And don't forget to subscribe to this channel for more stories that inspire, challenge, and remind you that second chances are real.